Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. With me is Yousef Munayyer. He's the executive director of the Palestine Center here in Washington. Welcome, Yousef.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be with you again.
So over the past few weeks, as everyone knows, we saw the restart of talks between the Israelis and Palestinians. Secretary of State John Kerry committed a lot of time to this issue. He's been to Israel and Palestine about 6 times since becoming Secretary of State. You've written a few pieces, all along. You've written quite a bit over the past few years about the shortcomings of this process as it's been managed by the United States over the past couple of decades, but specifically about how Secretary of State Kerry has gone about this and, the parameters or lack of parameters that the U.S. has supported going into this. So why don't you just go ahead and tell me some of your impressions and thoughts about the restart of talks?
Well, I think that the restart of talks has not this round has not addressed really the foundational problems, and the failures of American mediation in the past have also not addressed those foundational problems. Basically, this peace process is modeled in many ways after the peace process of the past, the Egyptian-Israeli peace process that brought forward the Camp David peace accords in 1979, which has for the most part been in place since then. And for the Israelis, it was a major thing. For the Egyptians, it was a major thing. And for the Americans, it was a major thing. The difference, of course, is that in that scenario, you're dealing with two powerful states. And you have, an American broker, but nonetheless, each side retained a capacity to alter realities on the ground through the use of significant force. I mean, you would not have had a peace agreement in 1979 were it not for the War of 1973, where Egypt was able to inflict some significant losses on the Israelis and get them to recalculate their position on the Sinai. And so even though the process that we see today is based on that same sort of framework, the players are very different. You don't have two powerful states here. You have one very powerful state and a people which it occupies, the Palestinian people. And so the ability to really use force to change dynamics on the ground is controlled by one party, the Israelis. So the mediator's role in this case has to be different. It can't simply be bringing the parties to the table as it had been in the past, committing the right sort of facilitation, the right sort of venues, the right sort of confidence in being engaged in the process over time. But really, you need to press one party, and that is the stronger party, the Israelis, to abide by certain commitments, because if not, there's no incentive for them to do so. And so without that, the negotiation table really becomes a butcher's block, where Israel is able to slice up and carve up whatever pieces of Palestine are remaining, and then say to the Palestinians, well, this is what we want you to accept, and if you don't like that, then too bad. And with every new resumption of talks, what's left on the butcher's block becomes smaller and smaller for the Palestinians. So there's really no incentive for the Israelis to make a deal that meets the Palestinian minimum. And there's no incentive for the Palestinians to continue engaging in a process where they know it's not going to yield an independent Palestinian state for them.
Do you think it was a bad move for Abbas even to re-enter talks?
Well, I don't think he has too much of a choice. Remember, the United States has a great deal of leverage over the Palestinian Authority. It's a leverage that it's developed over the years. It provides a significant amount of the Palestinian Authority's budget, a budget that has become so inflated over recent years, a patronage system that's become so inflated as well over recent years, that it's really necessary for the U.S. to keep funding the Palestinian Authority for it to merely stay afloat in the West Bank. So, I don't think he had too much of a choice in the matter, and ultimately was pushed in that direction. Was also pushed in that direction by members of the the Arab League and other Arab states, which were in turn pushed by Washington to make this happen. But he takes a significant risk in doing so because it's an extremely unpopular move among Palestinians to continue negotiating with the Israelis and take part in a process that has proven to be, really only a cover for continued Israeli settlement activity in Palestinian territory.
In terms of one party's leverage versus the other, I mean, I think it's a good point about the disparity, the massive power disparity between Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, do you see the UN bid, the international strategy, as having created any meaningful leverage on the Palestinian side?
I think it's a step in the direction of creating leverage, and I think you need to look at it as part of a growing trend of isolation that the Israelis are seeing. Internationalizing this conflict, and by internationalizing it, I mean really taking it out of the arena that is Washington. Washington has cornered this conflict, this issue for itself by its persistent use of vetoes in the UN Security Council, and has basically said, either we're going to deal with this or nobody else is. But bringing this into an international arena is an arena that is far more fair and far more helpful for the Palestinians, because there's more sympathy there than in a very pro-Israel country like the United States. So, the UN move is part of a process of internationalizing this. And the larger movement of internationalization includes not only appeals to the United Nations, but other international bodies, but also, the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions at both the civil society level and now the state and super-state level that we're starting to see in places like Europe most recently.
Yeah, what you're saying about internationalizing, it reminds me of something I heard from a pretty high-level European diplomat a couple of years ago, where he just straight out recognized, he was like, the U.S. is really unable to manage it toward a solution because of, he recognized the difficulty presented by U.S. domestic politics on this, and he said, I think his exact words were, the weight of the international consensus on this has to be brought to bear. So I think echoing a lot of what you said, saying, outside the United States, there's just an overwhelming consensus about what needs to happen. But yes, the United States has sort of cornered the market on this, for not entirely, unreasonable reasons. I mean, I think there is something to the idea that, the U.S. has an important role to play here as a guarantor of Israel's security. But as we've seen, that role can be very, very badly mismanaged.
Well, I think it's also part of the problem, too, because, the role that the United States has played in guaranteeing Israel's security has put it in a position where it feels so secure that it doesn't need to make any moves or any changes. If you look at this from the Israeli perspective, their economy is doing well. They have the strongest military in the region. The rest of the region is in complete chaos, falling apart. Regional threats are going to be limited to, in the near future, not strong states, but probably, semi-state actors that are an annoyance, but not a real serious threat to Israel's existence. They've got the largest per capita arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. They're very secure right now. So why would they end their occupation as long as they can benefit from it? And they continue to benefit from it economically, politically, in a number of different ways. So continuing to coddle the Israelis is not helping the situation. In fact, they need to be pressed for them to change their behavior.
So in terms of pressing the Israelis, what do you make of the EU regulations? Do you see that as a positive? the EU settlement regulations that were announced a couple of weeks ago?
I think again that's important because it's a step in the right direction. As far as what sort of effect that it's going to have monetarily, it's going to be extremely minimal. But I think it's important because it's sort of a watershed moment. It signals to the Israelis that the BDS movement, the movement along those lines to isolate Israel and also to place sanctions on it, is now moving from the civil society level to the state level. And that's where it can become really more potent. And while it's a preliminary step, it's a step that sends the message that there is more to come in this direction. And it's only going to continue to come in this direction so long as, the occupation persists. And at the same time, the occupation shows no signs of retreating. The Israelis are only entrenching themselves further into the West Bank. I think this is something that's going to play out for months and years to come. And, the kind of pressure that you'd need for a critical mass, the critical mass that would get the Israelis to say, hey, wait a minute, this is really a bad idea. We need to change course, is far more than what we're seeing today. But I think we're moving in that direction. And how far down the line, it's really impossible to tell. But we're getting there. Every single day we're getting closer, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, looking at the reaction of Israelis, at least Israeli officials, to the EU announcement, you think it was fairly significant. I was reminded of when I was there, let's see, in August of 2011, speaking to one Palestinian activist about the UN bid, as it was. And he said to me, he was like, I really didn't care about this until I saw how freaked out the Israelis were. Which he said sort of convinced him that this was a meaningful step for Abbas to take. And I think there's something similar going on here with the EU regulations. I mean, if you actually look at them as written and what they, do and do not actually impact, you can argue, as you have, that it's a fairly minimal step. But I mean, if you look at the reaction from Israelis, it seems to signal that it is actually quite meaningful.
Yeah, I think it is meaningful. But remember, at the end of the day, it comes down to the scale, and the interests in keeping the occupation are very significant for the Israelis. They have hundreds of thousands of settlers there. They've sunk billions and billions of dollars of costs into that territory. They profit and exploit the natural resources there. And withdrawing and resettling all those settlers would cost billions and billions of dollars, maybe, upwards of 10% of national GDP. So to actually take that step, the counterbalance has to be far more significant. And while this may be raising some eyebrows, it's not yet hitting paychecks and wallets yet. And it's not yet hitting voting constituencies yet. And I think that when it gets to that point, then maybe you start seeing some changes in actual state policy. But it's going to take a lot more.
So, looking specifically now at some of the efforts that Kerry has made, I wrote a piece, an issue brief for the Center for American Progress, published earlier this week, and then a short summary version of it on Open Zion yesterday, where I looked at some of the ways that some of the various aspects of what Secretary Kerry has been doing, and I think, even while, it's, pessimism is kind of the order of the day, I see some reason for some cautious optimism in the way that Kerry seems to be, he's teeing up a number of efforts in order to give these talks the best chance possible to succeed. I mean, do you agree with that, or do you see nothing different in the way the U.S. is going about this?
Well, I think, as I said earlier on, the United States has a tremendous amount of leverage over the Palestinian Authority, right? They are the single greatest ally of the State of Israel on the face of the earth. Essentially, the United States, the Palestinian Authority and Israel are essentially U.S. clients. So, the more interesting question to me is not, does getting these parties to the table after so many months of persistent work, is that a reason for optimism? The question for me is really, why is it so difficult for the United States to bring two client states to the table, not to actually do anything yet, but just to sit down? And the reason for that is because the parties, particularly the Palestinians, don't have faith in the process. And so, there are incentives created just to get to the table, but never to really do anything once you're there, and never to really get a deal done once you're there. So, the parties, for the Israelis, this is an opportunity to kind of reinforce the message that their occupation is temporary, even though their actions say otherwise. And for the Palestinians, it's an opportunity to get some small, goodies, whether it's the release of some prisoners, or perhaps an economic incentives package, or minor change in conditions in the West Bank, even temporary. Just to use this opportunity to get something small, because they know that there's no hope to get something larger out of it, because the process is what it is and what it's been. So I think if we're going to be optimistic about this, if there's going to be a reason to be optimistic about this, there has to be a fundamental change in the way the process is handled for us to believe that there are any incentives pushing these parties to actually come to an agreement, and not simply come to the table after all of this time and not go anywhere after that.
Right. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges here, for people trying to analyze the process and answer those questions that you raised, they're good questions, is that, so much of this is being kept secret. And I think there's an argument for that, in terms of not letting things be negotiated out in the press, not creating opportunities for, critics amongst Palestinians and Israelis to attack, the process, or, the various steps that are being taken. But I do think a lot, and I wrote this in my issue brief, is that, a huge part of this has to be, in my view, the United States, even if the Israelis, even if, we're okay with, even if it requires going into this without the Israelis endorsing the 67 lines as a basis for discussions, that the United States sticks to the articulated policy of President Obama. And makes it clear that this is the basis that we are using. This is something that the Palestinian negotiators, as we know, have tried to get for a long, long time. And you read the notes that came out of the negotiation support unit in the Palestine papers a couple of years ago, and what you see are Palestinian negotiators constantly trying to create an agreed upon, term of reference, and the Israelis resisting. Which they've continued to do. So I think, and it's frustrating because, we just don't know if that's happening. I hope it is, but I think that is something that I think would make a big difference. Do you agree?
Well, I think I think that it is very problematic, the fact that, it is being kept so secret. And, there is an argument to be made for keeping things secret, because to keep the parties at the table, you want to prevent, spoilers from coming in, and so on and so forth. But you have to remember, for Palestinians in particular, Palestinian stakeholders are all over the region, including refugees, including Palestinians inside Israel, including Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip. And the fate of their grievances, the fate of their situations moving forward, are really going to be determined by representatives on their behalf that are at this point unelected and seen by many widely as illegitimate representatives. And so to present a agreement at the end of these negotiations to a Palestinian public that has not been primed or prepared for what, if we follow the conventional American-Israeli understanding of what are to be Palestinian concessions, including no right of return for Palestinians, and for Israel retain major settlements and so on. these are not going to be welcomed by a Palestinian public at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we were really setting up the process for failure by not engaging the Palestinian public on this issue, especially because you have this legitimacy question on the Palestinian end. On the Israeli end, the Israeli government at least represents the the Israeli Jewish population, and from their end, it's a little bit easier. Because they don't have this legitimacy question. On the Palestinian end, you do. So that I think complicates things further. And I wonder, even if you get to the point where you go through all these negotiations, let's say you have an agreement, how is a Palestinian president supposed to bring such an agreement to the Palestinian people and say, you lost 80% of your homeland, now you're going to give up on even more, so what do you guys think? Do you agree? I mean, it's not something that's going to work. It's political suicide, and it's probably why it has not worked in the past. But going back to the other point that you made about the framework and about agreeing on the 67 lines as a starting point, that's an important step, but the devil's always in the details. And when we talk about using it as a basis, the question then becomes which settlement blocks. This is where things got hung up on the question of borders so much in the past. The Israelis want to retain the maximum number of settlers and settlements that they can, including the major blocks, which divide up Palestinian territory and make it impossible for Palestinians to have a normal functioning economy and state in one contiguous territory. And the U.S. position on that has always been essentially whatever the Israelis want goes. And
I don't know if that's quite true. I mean, I think that changed under George W. Bush with that exchange of letters with Sharon.
Well, during the Annapolis process, and that was under Bush.
Yeah, but that was after that.
Yeah, but
that was after that exchange
right.
of letters. Yeah.
But I don't think that's changed at this point. And I think, in fact, what has happened since then is that the Israeli government has continued to push their public in a direction where the majority now wants to retain the majority of settlements.
Yeah.
And those are numbers in public opinion polling that I don't think we saw 15 years ago. But today it's become very clear that the Israeli public wants to retain the majority of these settlements. And
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if the polling really affirms that.
Well, multiple polls have shown that over time. There was one recently, one before that in November as well that corroborated that. And even if we're talking about it's a majority, but let's say we're talking about a slim majority like 51%, it's still a politically very unpopular move. That is amplified when the government is made up of a coalition that is highly dependent on a settler constituency.
Yeah.
So, when we talk about Annapolis, for example, and you mentioned the Palestine Papers, I think that's important. In the Palestine Papers, there was this one really important conversation that was going on at the time in the negotiations between Palestinian negotiators and Israelis at the highest level and the Secretary of State. And, the Palestinians say to, the Israelis and to Secretary of State Rice at the time, we can't, have Ma'aleh Adumim left inside, a Palestinian state. And, the Secretary of State says, well, no Israeli leader is going to accept that. And the Palestinians said, well, no Palestinian leader is going to accept that. And the response from the Secretary of State was very simply, then you're not going to have your state. And so, it's that kind of position, that American position that reinforces whatever the Israeli position is on these really important issues that, makes it very difficult for there to be any movement forward in this process.
Right. No, I mean, but that's why I think
I mean, it's certainly correct, I think, to say that, the U.S. has always been closer to Israel than to the Palestinians. That's, patently obvious, so obvious it's kind of dumb to recognize. But I think there was an extent to, that exchange of letters between Bush and Sharon, I think, marked a new level of the U.S. The U.S. is essentially just resolving one of the key issues under dispute in favor of the Israelis in a way that I think was different. And some people argue, oh, well, it helped Sharon pull out of Gaza. I just don't quite buy that. I think, in retrospect, I think that move just dramatically further undermined the U.S.'s reputation as an able broker, to the extent it still had that reputation.
I think, too, you're starting to see something very similar during Obama's tenure. Not with the settlements, but with the definition of Israel as a Jewish state, which has become a key point for the Netanyahu government, and has been one that has been, a statement that's become more and more prevalent in U.S. official policy and U.S. official statements since the Obama administration took office. And I think that may be this administration's version of the Bush letter in the past on a major issue, which will certainly undermine the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is a new. I'm not sure how far. I think you can find mention of it in the past, but clearly Netanyahu has kind of elevated this to a key new concession or condition, although he never calls it a precondition. He just makes clear that it's something he's going to demand.
Right.
So, the very important question, I think, going back a bit to what you were talking about in terms of, the legitimacy that the Palestinian Authority enjoys or does not enjoy, or the PLO as the voice of the Palestinian diaspora and all the various Palestinian stakeholders. Even leaving aside the Gaza West Bank split, or maybe not. Just how would you go about solving that problem? Do we need to start moving toward elections while negotiations ongoing? Doesn't that seem a bit difficult? What's your answer to the legitimacy problem?
Well, I think you have to look at the genesis of it, and I think you have to look at a number of different problems. But I think some form of elections for the Palestinian National Congress, which has not had elections in God knows how many years, would be a step.
Since 2006, right?
No, that's the Legislative Council, and the National Congress has been years before that, since the last elections, and that would add a great degree of legitimacy, I think, to an organization that claims to represent all Palestinians. But, you have to remember, prior to Oslo, the PLO was an umbrella organization that really did, have itself based in a number of places where Palestinians existed. It had strong and functioning offices in a number of different places. But it, during Oslo, has since more or less imploded into what is today the Palestinian Authority. And even though it has relocated into Palestine and is refocused into Palestine, it has lost many connections with Palestinian communities elsewhere. And those Palestinian communities remain major stakeholders in the outcome of these negotiations. So there needs to be some sort of correction in representation, legitimacy of that representation, and I do think that elections would go a long way in accomplishing that.
So, in the last few minutes that we have here, say these talks go nowhere. What, in your view, is the best next step for the Palestinian leadership, the PLO?
Well, I think all Palestinian parties now agree in one way or another that the Israelis are not going to voluntarily leave the West Bank. They're not going to voluntarily stop building settlements. They're not going to voluntarily stop exploiting Palestinian resources. This is going to have to be done through coercion. Where there is disagreement among Palestinian factions is what type of coercion to use. And there are some that are still wedded to the principle of armed struggle, others that believe in internationalizing this conflict through international organizations, let's say like the United Nations or what have you, the International Criminal Court, and another segment altogether that believes in engaging civil society through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The reality is it will take coercion, and it will take continued coercion even during the months of these negotiations, whether they work or not. And so I think that has to be the path that they follow and continue to follow. Because whether, ultimately there is going to have to be an agreement of some sort. But it's not going to happen unless Israel is pushed to make that agreement. Because right now it's enjoying very much its occupation. It as much as there are groups out there and individuals, particularly on the Israeli left, who try to create the impression that ending the occupation is in Israel's interest, in this long-term sense of interest based on this idea of a Jewish democracy, it is not in Israel's economic interest. It is not in the Israeli government's political interest. And until those things change, until it actually becomes in the interests of the state, the Israelis are not going to move towards withdrawing from the West Bank, not even 1 inch. They're only going to continue to build there because they're reaping the benefits of it. So I think for the... Go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, it's not just. I take your point. But it's it's something we hear from Israeli security officials as well. But I take your point. It's economically and politically, the incentives are just not there. But I think it's worth also recognizing, the voices of former Shin Bet heads, the people featured in the Gatekeepers. Yuval Diskin, the former Shin Bet chief, wrote a very good long op-ed. If somewhat rambling, but still took very, very serious issue with the way that Netanyahu was failing to manage this.
There's no doubt that there are security costs that Israel faces because of the occupation. But if you look at the percentage of Israeli defense consumption as a percentage of their GDP, it is the lowest that it's been in history. And is dropped by half in the past 20 years. So yes, there are costs associated, military costs associated with the occupation, but as a relative cost in comparison to the rest of all the costs involved in withdrawing, it is far smaller today than it's ever been. And so that scale needs to shift. And I think isolating Israel internationally and increasing coercion through sanctions and other measures that will hit the actual pocketbooks of people, that will then change Israeli behavior. But the way things stand right now, it is so far off and so distant to the future that it's not tangible. It's not tangible for decision makers today. It's very abstract. And so a lot has to change before that really becomes reality today.
All right, well, let's stop there. Thanks so much for doing this. I really, really enjoyed it.
Same here, as always. Thank you, Matt.
All right, man. Talk to you later.
Take care.